This is episode 25 of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm Jeff Kaiser. It is February 13th, 2022. Almost Valentine's Day. Wow, okay. Feel like we just celebrated Christmas. We have on the podcast a panel interview, which I am super excited for because this is the first panel interview on the Florida Sound Archive. We have three members of a band known as the Stick Figures, who were out of the Tampa area back in the late 70s and early 80s. Maready Evergreen, Bill Carey, and Robert Dansby. Welcome on in today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Nice to see you and nice to be here.
It's nice to have you on. So there's a lot that we're going to be getting into today. A lot of really great stuff to talk about because you have an old new record that just came out. So that's something we definitely want to talk a little bit about there. And as far as I know, you're all in different places, right now. Where's each of you located?
I'm in Bonita Springs, Florida.
I'm in Hillsborough, North Carolina.
I'm in Santa Paula, California.
Wow. So I'm going to start, Robert, with you first. When did you exit Florida?
When we moved to New York in, oh Lord, somebody help
November of 1981.
Yeah, I can't. Was it 81? Okay, my brain says 80, but we were still in Tampa. So yeah, the fall of 81. I mean, I think we did those gigs in Atlanta, and then no, that was June. No, okay, so no, it was, yeah, you're right. I can't remember, but when everybody moved up.
Trust me, he moved up there in November of 81.
Bill knows.
You guys went back down to Florida after Atlanta, and David and I carried on to Baltimore and then New York.
That's right. Yes. Senility is an ugly thing. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And Moretti, when did you exit Florida?
So after New York, I went back to Florida to finish my degree. And then in the late 80s, I moved to North Carolina to study art at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So that was my exit.
That was your exit there.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill, what about you? You're in Florida now, but you're just visiting, right?
No. I've been back in Florida for about 18 years.
Oh, okay.
I left in June of 81, and I went to New York following a brief stint in Baltimore where I recorded with a band called MEMB, and then we all met in New York to regroup. And then when the band split up, the three of us actually ended up staying on in New York for quite a while. Moretti and I played in another band together, and we all were active up there for a while. And then at various points, Moretti went on to studying. I went for a 6-week tour in London and ended up staying there for 18 years. And Robert went the other direction. So I lived out in London and with a brief spell in Hong Kong. Sorry, I've been around a bit. And then I went back to London, and then I came back here 18 years ago. And at some point in the not too distant future, I'll probably be heading back to London again. Actually, not London, but the north of England, Northumberland.
I don't know if it's just me, but I can hear a little bit of your accent. Does it a little bit?
My accent's been around.
Yeah. He always says proper. I like that.
Yeah, that's because it's proper.
It's proper. Very nice. So your friendship, kind of going back to the very beginning, did you all meet while you were going to school at University of South Florida? Or did you have any meetings or anything prior to that?
No, I originally, I started a band in 1970, end of 78, beginning of 79, with David and some other friends of ours. That band played around until our lead singer finished college and moved away. David had met Sid in the music department because they were both music majors. And we then sort of press ganged Moretti into joining us on vocals. And then Rob, who is Sid's brother, joined us from Jacksonville later on. So we all, met through a series of separate incidences. Well, obviously not the two pairs of siblings knew each other a lot longer than the rest of us did.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you find that you had a lot of similarities in what you were listening to musically, and how did you all kind of come together with that?
That's when you could actually have like record listening parties and like wait impatiently for the Clash's new album to come out so you could all sit together and marvel and drink a lot of wine. So yeah, it was nice.
Yeah, we had lasagna and haircut parties. Remember that?
Oh yes.
What
Yeah.
exactly took place at one of those types of parties?
Well, there would be dinner followed by drinking, followed by cutting each other's hair.
And
I mean,
nonstop
we
record
were
playing.
DIY in more ways than just the music. So
Yeah.
Well, it's nice though to look out into the cameras and everyone still has their hair and everything, which is wonderful to see.
Well, that's probably because of my camera more than my hair.
We still
yes,
got our
I can attest the other two still have some of theirs. So David has a full head of hair still. So
yes, he does.
Very
Yes, he does.
nice.
Mhm.
And for those that are listening in, if you're listening to the interview on a streaming platform, you are hearing everyone. If you are watching the interview on YouTube, you can see us and know exactly what we're talking about here, which is wonderful. So, so you met back in the late 70s at the University of South Florida. What was it like at that time? Because I wasn't born until 1980. So kind of growing up at that time, what was it like in the Tampa area music wise? Was there a scene going on? What are some of your memories of that time?
well, one of the things that was interesting about Tampa is that it wasn't a typical Florida city. It was still a shipbuilding city in those days and a little bit of cigar trade. It was at that point, Busch Gardens, which is the biggest sort of tourist draw there, was still just a brewery with a little pub room. There were no animals or rides or anything like that until, a couple of years later. So it was very different in that it was like it was an industrial city. It wasn't a tourist destination like a lot of Florida cities are. So it was very different than Miami or Fort Lauderdale or anywhere on that coast. There's quite a few universities there. And when I first got there, this would be end of 77, beginning of 78. Um, a friend and I discovered that there were some punk bands playing in a little dive bar. So we went along to that and we met some of the people who we'd later get to know in the other bands. We went and we saw a band called Just Boys, and they were a kind of power pop outfit, and they played around for a while before moving out to California. So yeah, there were a few bands around. There were several people, who were like regulars on the scene, and we got to know them over time, and then got to know a couple of people who were playing in bands. And then when we put a band together, the first one being the Art Holes, then we were able to start, going and playing in the gigs. So it was great because all the bands, and there were, lots of bands happening, and we didn't all sound the same, but we all sort of like came from a common place. Um, and we all sort of supported each other literally by playing together, but also by helping each other with gear and just going to see each other's shows and everything.
Mhm.
So it was a pretty great scene, especially for me coming from a small town in Southwest Florida where there wasn't really anything happening.
Yeah, it was very lively. It was a very lively group of people. And I think we've said before, maybe there were 100 people that were into the type of music that we were listening to. So it was this very small, very tight-knit group of people. So it was a very interesting time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a lot more. I mean, I grew up in Jacksonville. Sid and I grew up in Jacksonville, and it was just so much. I hate to use the word cosmopolitan, but it was just so different for us, and it was so much. You know, you could go to USF, or you could go to Ybor City, or you could go downtown to the Tampa Art Museum, and people knew who Brian Eno was, or knew who Joseph Beuys was. And for me, that was like kind of, yeah, I think I'm going to move down here. And plus, in a little tiny area between the sort of South Bay area and Tampa and Clearwater and St. Pete, there's like, I don't know, 5 colleges.
Yeah.
And that was kind of great.
Right. And thinking about the area itself, with a lot of the different venues that local bands were playing, maybe more national bands were playing at, what are some of those places you remember maybe seeing shows at, or maybe even eventually playing at with the Stick Figures and with other bands you may have been with too?
When we started out, there weren't really a lot of venues playing alternative type music. Later on, we had an Agora Ballroom, and later on, you started getting some shows at the Tampa Theater. For example, the Tampa Theater had Blondie, The Police, various bands like that. The first Stiffs tour of America with Elvis Costello headlining did come through. They played in a high life, Fronton. Being from Florida, you know what that is, right? So
Yep.
They played in a highline Fronton. There was maybe 100 people in the audience and about 50 cops lining the stage because, the headlines were, punk rock comes to Tampa. So, it was a sort of odd, but later more places developed. But by the time they had a bigger scene, and some of the other bands there were doing support acts for people, we had kind of up sticks and left. I mean, I think I saw a few shows at the Agora when it opened before I left. I think I saw Iggy and John Cale there. But I know there were a lot of shows later on that became quite a regular venue. The Tampa Theater, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's like our version of the Fox Theater in Atlanta. It's our big, ornate old theater. And besides showing lots of movies, they do have concerts there. And they did one time put on a showcase for local alternative bands. So, some of ourselves and some of the other bands that were kind of on the scene at the time got to go and play there, which was nice because, proper stage, proper lights. So that was good. But, our bread and butter was playing either in a room at the university or playing in dive bars like My Backyard, the Buffalo Roadhouse, and Ms. Lucky's.
Ms. Lucky was awesome.
It was. And if you got kicked out for dancing too much, you could watch the bands between the walls were actually made of slats, and you could actually watch, from outside and still see the band. So it really was a dive.
That was one of the flyers that I think, Robert, you had shared with me, was at Miss Lucky's. So talk about the flyers, because the flyers that I've seen are some of my favorites. I love the DIY aesthetic to those flyers. So who was creating those, and talk a little bit about some of the flyers?
The flyers were like this communal. They were like the lasagna haircut parties. It's like this thing. If we had a gig, we would all get together like near a Xerox machine, or like just get a bunch of stuff out and start gluing things together. I mean, I remember one time Dave had, I can't remember who had it, but somebody had a sheet of Letraset, which for our viewers, in the old days, you used to buy type on sheets of waxed paper and rub it off onto sort of your layout to get specific fonts. Like there were no computers or anything like that. And somebody had a sheet of Letraset. And I remember Dave and I sort of feverishly trying to find the exact letters that we want, because it was already used. So you use up the letters and they're gone, to make a I should dig this up at some point, a flyer for Miss Lucky. And I think we ended up like making up words and using, numbers for letters and that sort of thing. But it was like this kind of a project thing. And a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Bill and I were talking about this the other day, and I have this really clear memory of the one that's the sort of color image of the big German, I think it's actually one of the guys in Kraftwerk's father that was an architect, and I was all excited by that. So we did a lot of buildings that his dad had done as background for our gigs. We were writing all of this stuff on the poster, and Dave goes, "Put some bad words on there. Write some curse words or something like that." I'm like, "Oh, I don't know. That's kind of dumb." No, do it. So I wrote "damn!" exclamation point. And I'm like, "That's as far as I'm going to go, Dave. I'm sorry." But I think that's on one of the color images of yours. If you look closely, you can see "damn." So that was my wild, being spurred on by David, one of my wild moments.
Gonna have to look a little closer. It's like one of those things that might be hidden. You know, that you have to really look close to find. So, Moretti, you being the vocalist, at least the primary vocalist of the Stick Figures, what was it like for you? You know, at that time, because there were some bands that were fronted by women, but not like it is today, where there's so many more female fronted groups. So, what was that like for you at that time?
Well, I was kind of, my brother auditioned me. He was just like, "Yeah, we need a singer. Come here." And so he had me just sing along with, like, I feel like I sang along with some Stevie Wonder songs. and he was like, "Well, you seem like you can, yeah, you're okay. All right." So then I was suddenly the singer. And it was really interesting. I was not a musician like the other people in the band, so I was much more coming from a writing background and visual art background. But I feel like I participated fully in all of the mayhem and whatnot that was going on, and I don't know. I felt equal. I didn't feel like it was a problem. Um, I didn't feel like the girl singer.
Right.
So,
If there's one sound that I hear, and there's a lot of different, that's one of the most amazing things about the Stick Figures music, is how advanced it was in terms of the different sound fusion that was being produced. I hear a lot of New York no wave, that whole scene. Were you all listening to that kind of like arty type? It wasn't punk, but it kind of was punk, but it wasn't like, it was different. Were you listening to that kind of stuff at that time?
Yes,
Absolutely.
yeah. We in 1979, there was a woman. I know her name. I've just forgotten her name. Vivian Dick, who was like a filmmaker within the no wave movement up in New York. And for some reason, she came down and had like a little film festival in the bar at the university. And we were like the support act. So we actually, played, but we absolutely knew what was going on up there. The funny thing back then is you couldn't just check something out on YouTube or whatever. You would read about stuff, and a lot of this stuff came out in very small numbers, and they didn't carry a lot of it in Tampa. So stuff coming from London and New York, a lot of times we'd read about it and then say, "Oh, we should do something like that," never having heard it. And we would do like an interpretation of what we thought in our minds it must sound like based on a review by Lester Bangs or Robert Christgau or somebody. And then later on, we'd actually hear this stuff. And, in a lot of cases, we didn't sound like what it sounded like, but, in some way you could have described what we were doing. So, we were influenced often by the actual artifact, the music, but sometimes more just by descriptions of it by other people.
From the research that I have done and a lot of the music that I'm aware of, and that, especially in that part of Florida, there wasn't a lot of other bands that sounded like the Stick Figures. When you would play a show, what was the reaction like from the crowd and other bands that you would gig with?
They enjoyed it then, and there was a lot of dancing. I mean, nowadays dancing and gigs are kind of separate, but back then you would go to see an original band locally and you would dance to it. So when we were playing, there were people like, dancing and milling about and shouting and everything else. I mean, it was not a static audience.
Mm.
No.
So, and a lot of those people even now are kind of like Facebook friends, and a lot of other people were musicians. Some people who weren't musicians sort of joined bands because we had more of a DIY aesthetic, and a lot of times, we would be switching instruments and playing stuff where we weren't necessarily very adept. And I think that kind of opened the door for that thing with other people. So you had people joining bands. And I think that's why it was a great little scene, is because you had all these people around, and you had lots of other cultural influences with the universities and stuff. And people started kind of like forming bands who weren't necessarily quote unquote musicians, but they started making music. I mean, again, we didn't invent that. I mean, bands like the Mekons and Delta and Five and all those bands came from a very similar kind of background, and we were listening to all of them, But we didn't sort of limit ourselves to playing what we could play. We often just kind of said, okay, I'm going to pick this up and now I'm going to play it. So, and we would just sort of like wrestle sounds from whatever it was we were using. I mean, we all had different levels of, ability. David was actually, besides playing bass, which he played for us, he also played bass clarinet, saxophone, piano. He was studying music, and he was actually still is a very proficient musician, as was Sid. And Sid was a very good drummer, and he played violin as well as guitar, but he wasn't a studied guitar player. So part of the reason our guitar sounds, in my mind, and I really have come to understand this better in going back and reviewing the music as I kind of remastered it all, a lot of times he's playing stuff that sounds like if Chuck Berry was playing double stops in a violin instead of playing a guitar. It's like these weird voicings of things that it's like, yeah, that's kind of rock and roll, but it's not quite regular. And then I come from much more of a kind of like straight Beatles, Stones, Who, and then the Clash, the Jam, the New York Dolls, much more of that kind of a guitar playing tradition. So when you kind of put the two of us together, it's part of what gives it this weird, off kilter sort of sound. And Robert, actually, drums wasn't his. You played a bunch of different things, didn't you? You played violin as well, didn't you?
I tried, yeah. But I mean, Sid and I both grew up playing the violin, and I was like the last chair guy in the high school orchestra, and he was concert master. If that I think that's the best, yardstick for my musical ability. But I mean, we took piano, and I mean, in the way we learned drums is, we took percussion classes, formally, but we had a drum kit. God bless my poor parents. In our upstairs, 3-story house in Florida with a drum kit. So we put on our COS headphones and play along with whatever, we liked that week. And I mean, good God, I can imagine my poor father coming home from work and hearing this bum, 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 above his head. But that was really how we became, more centered towards the drums. I mean, Sid was a much better drummer than I was. Sid came from that, when you're really a little kid and you listen to stuff like Bill Bruford and Carl Palmer, Sid thought those guys were just the greatest. I liked them, but it's like I never had hand skills like that. And then, my brain was more wired towards Charlie Watts or Chris Franz or later Terry Chambers, the drummer for XTC. I thought, God, how's he doing that stuff with the low end, but he's still playing the snare and the hi-hat. So I mean, my approach to drumming was much more conceptual because I just not particularly adept.
And I mean, there were songs where Moretti played bass while we were all playing different instruments. Songs where, like on September, she plays the little xylophone, which I think was like a sort of like little kid's toy one, wasn't it? With
No,
different colored
little orchestra bells. I think those are Sid's orchestral bells, which are like a xylophone but tiny.
Yeah. I do think it's really interesting because David and Sid both were, studying music theory. And listening to a lot of classical music. And then we had Bill with his rock and roll, solid craziness. And I do think that mixture of putting that together was just really interesting. I don't think we thought about it at the time at all, but yeah, it was neat.
What studio did you record the EP in?
It was recorded in Kenny Veenstra's Progressive Music Studio on Davis Island, which was he lived. Was that his mother's house or his house? It's
No,
basically over the garage, a little room
it was his
over the
parents.
garage,
Yeah.
and he
Yeah, it was
had
like a little apartment above the garage at his parents' house.
yeah,
That's my
and
memory.
he had an 8-track in there, but he had I don't even remember what kind of mics he had, but he had had an actual Mellotron, which was a big deal for all of us because we grew up with the Beatles, you know, and then later some of the prog groups used them.
Yeah.
But you know, and you know, we would go in there, and the thing was, we never had a lot of money, so we'd go in there, and we'd be like, in one session, we would want to record 132 songs and do overdubs and mix them. And of course, poor Kenny, I was later a recording engineer myself, so I know what it was like. Come the end of the day, he'd like to say, okay, we're done, let's, you know, go home and have his dinner. But no, we'd be like, just 7 more songs, you know. So we recorded everything very quickly in just a couple of takes. We didn't really, we tried to cram in as much as we could because we were on our own dime, and we always had all these songs we wanted to get done. So they weren't necessarily very highly polished, but the good thing is, you know, it's essentially cassette mixes from when we recorded them that most of this album and a lot of the next one, because we've got another album's worth of tracks to put out, what they come from. I mean, you know, the EP was mixed more completely, but the rest of the songs really were just rough mixes when we finished recording them.
Didn't
So,
we recorded in New York like from 11 at night to 7 in the morning because it was cheaper?
yeah,
Yeah,
and that was
Yeah.
at a place called Noise, New York. Rob, you remember more of the details about that one, don't you?
Yeah, it was up by Penn Station, I think on 34th Street, and I think Frank Eaton, who's now in Miami, owned it with his brother, and then I think he might have even done some of the engineering in our initial sessions, and then Kevin Folan did most of the engineering for some of our later sessions. And I
just
remember walking
I remember
home.
falling asleep. I was asleep
Yeah,
essentially the entire night, and every once in a while someone would poke me and say, "All right, sing."
yeah. I think
Okay, where
it was
am
like
I?
midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning, and then Sid and I lived in New Jersey because it was so much cheaper, like directly across the river from the Upper West Side, and we were too poor or too cheap, go, you know, either way, to take a cab up to the Port Authority to take our, like, we had to wait till, like, you know, well, I guess 8 o'clock in the morning is about the time we got out. But we'd haul, like, you know, drums or guitars or, you know, fill in the blank up 8th Avenue up to the Port Authority and then go get in line to go get on this bus. And it was just like, how we didn't get murdered or robbed or whatever, I have no idea. Because I think the bus station was in the middle of Hell's Kitchen, and we were just like completely naive. Well, I don't know if we were naive, we were oblivious.
Well, I mean, that bus station was never as bad as it seemed. I actually spent the night there on a few occasions when when I was still living in New Jersey, and I would go to a club and I wouldn't leave early enough, and I'd miss the last bus, and then you would just end up sleeping in the bus station. So
Yeah, I don't think they ran between 3 and 6 in the morning. So if you got out of Danceteria or Mud at 3,
exactly.
you had to wait 3 hours, baby, and it was like very pleasant.
What was the reception like when you played shows up in New York?
We never
did.
actually did.
You never did.
We finished our 2 shows in Atlanta with The Fall and the Lounge Lizards. Then David and I went to New York and recorded a single with NEMB. Then we carried on to New York and everyone else joined us. We started recording what was supposed to be an album. And really there's only 4 tracks that we still have the masters from. Most of the other masters have all disappeared over time, God knows where. But David found those in the basement of his apartment in New York, where he's been living for must be like 25, 30 years that he was there. He's recently moved out. But other than that, we we never actually got around to doing a gig or completing the recordings. So, essentially just New York was a pretty tough place to live back then. And, we moved up there and none of us had any reserve cash. So some of us found it easier than others, partly because some of us got, jobs that made life a bit easier. And other people struggled more. So there was a lot of kind of up and down from Florida to New York for a couple of years there to see who ended up where. But essentially, we never got around to playing a gig up there.
When the 7-inch EP came out, were there any radio stations, whether they be in Tampa or in just Florida in general or other parts of the country, that were picking up on the record?
Yes. I mean, oddly, now that I'm out here, there was a couple of Los Angeles stations, and I believe a San Francisco station and a Seattle station that played them a lot. KXLU here and KPFK had a show that had like new music, and I don't know. I don't think I got these when I got out here. I think I got them either in Tampa or New York, but I had these little flyers that maybe Pam had given us that had like playlists from KXLU, Los Angeles, and KPFK that had us on these playlists. And I was just like, California?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think we got some plays on FMU as well.
Yeah.
WFMU. We might have gotten, I can't remember if we were played. There was a show on Yale radio, college radio. And we used to get played all the time in Tampa because the community radio station there, WMNF, when we were sort of like before we'd recorded or anything, we were playing a gig at the Buffalo Roadhouse, and a older than us by a few years, but still young couple came up to us and said that they had just moved down from Boston. And they were moving down. They had both done law degrees, and they were going to do legal aid law. And they were really excited to find a place where they were playing that kind of music, because they were used to living in Boston where they could always go see that, and they were big music fans. So they went to WMNF, which was mostly jazz, bluegrass, classical, etc. And they said, why don't you do like an alternative rock type of show? And the people at the station were like, okay, you can do it. And they had no idea how to run a station, but they went in and learned, and they built a show that became like a real linchpin for our whole scene. So all the bands you could record a demo or get a good live tape, and they played on the radio. And then of course we had a whole younger generation of people, many of whom we came to know later on in person, but at that time they were like 14 or 15 and couldn't go to a club, and they were actually listening to the local bands on the radio because Pam and John were so supportive of all the bands. And they also acted as our sort of they acted as our management, because we didn't have anyone else, and they were like proper adults with legal degrees. So Pam helped us with lots of stuff like sending out flyers. She helped us with copyright stuff. She helped us do our little record label, Green Records, that we put out our stuff on. So that radio station was actually great because they played everything all the time. And to this day, they've got loads of great music shows on WMNF that's just carried on because of what they started. So we were very fortunate to have that. We did get played on John Peel. Of course, we couldn't hear it because they're still building an archive of all of his shows based on a couple of guys who used to tape them every week. So they're basically taking those and building an online archive. But last I checked, the show that we were on wasn't there yet. So, we did get some airplay, but each and every time you had to individually mail out a single, because we didn't have a promo department. So it was all DIY. We did it all, ourselves with a bit of help from Pam and John. So it's just so much easier now. And even, there started being more of a network with, what was it called? CMJ, College Music Journal, sort of picked up and became the de facto center for alternative music on radio stations, small labels, et cetera, et cetera. But when we first put ours out, that was really just starting up. So we didn't really have any infrastructure to lean on. And you try and sell your record into record stores, but nobody had ever heard of you. So it was really hard in those days to kind of get the word out if you didn't have a record label of some sort behind you. So, but we did, we did remarkably well for the resources we had, I think. But
how do you think someone like John Peel got a hold of some of your music?
well, I know that he got it because he mentioned it in the letter he sent us through. There was a music, well, more like a newspaper. It was like a slightly larger than a fanzine, coming out of Dublin back then, called Dublin Hot Press, and they did a review of the single because we would send it to all these places, and he would read all those kind of articles looking for bands to play in his show. So he read the review and then sent us a letter asking if he could buy the record. So, but he actually mentioned
Yeah, I
that.
think it was Nigel Burnham, right?
Yeah,
that wrote the little. It was a little column,
yeah.
really
So
glowing.
yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on with fanzines and underground magazines and things like that, but it was all a lot harder to find, than just going online.
Mm.
Because you can imagine that, somebody's literally making some little magazine in their bedroom, or there's a very, very small staff putting something out that they basically make with a photocopier. It's hard for them, just like we were trying to get our music out, they'd be trying to get their publication out, and they'd have the same issues, that there was no real distribution network. So, I mean, that was just how things were at the time, and it was kind of part of the deal. I know at one point we also got a request from Jello Biafra, who had read about our record and wanted to buy a copy of it. So,
Oh wow!
these things came through occasionally, and it was exciting when they did. But again, we couldn't go. I've still never heard the John Peel show that we were on, so I don't know if there was an introduction or what. He usually said something about all the records he played. So, still waiting to actually hear the audio from that. So it was all kind of like far away. You felt like you were receiving communications from Mars when you would hear about these things. So,
with all that you were doing at this point, what was your family's reactions, your parents and stuff? Were they supportive? Were they into your music? Did they just kind of let you do your thing? What was that like for your families?
Well, for speaking for my mother, she was incredibly supportive and into it. And she would have these fellas over on Sundays and make these ridiculous, enormous dinners. So, and they all had, hollow legs. So it was an insane amount of food being fed into these guys. I remember my brother lost a train ticket once. We were going to Baltimore, and my mother did not have very much money, but she somehow dug up enough money so that we could take the trip. So, my dad was indifferent, but he was always indifferent about everything. So it wasn't anything, nothing special about that.
yeah,
But,
Moretti's mother was like we actually thank her on the record because she was absolutely key to kind of like keeping us all alive, and she had a great sense of humor and just kind of put up with us all the time. And she used to like give us her car, and we would load all of our gear into the trunk of her car and carry it to gigs. I mean, just here's the keys to my car, and off we would go. So
I totally forgot about that. That's
yeah,
right.
she was incredibly supportive. My parents have still to this day never seen me play. They're more into Ray Conniff, so
Okay.
I'm not really their style. They weren't unsupportive. And when we made a record, they were like, "You made a record," because they thought that it actually, meant that we were going to be wealthy or something, which I guess would have translated better, but not the case.
Yeah, my parents were only concerned that Sid and I get our degrees and go into graduate school and find something proper like lawyering or doctoring. So they weren't too excited about us moving to New York. But I mean, my father did the same thing when he was in college. He ended up moving to New York. So sorry, Dad. The acorn does not fall far from the tree. But I want to say something about Gloria. Moretti's mom wasn't just like nurturing. It wasn't just like food. It wasn't just like, a place to go on Sundays. It was also this sort of all day thing where like the art books came out and magazines came out, and like we talked about things for long periods of time. I mean, David and I talked about this in the last year or so, that it was like to somebody like that's 19 or 20 years old, which I think I was 21 maybe 20 or 21, I can't remember. It was like, for me, it was like this sort of salon where you went and talked about stuff, and we weren't in the middle of band practice, or we weren't at school. So it was a little bit more of a more fun and different range of topics and conversations. But it was like, all the magazines came out, and I still remember she had all these Andy Warhol books, which of course, like, I immediately pulled out and, was sitting on the couch looking at. And it was so great because it was like we'd eat and have a wonderful dinner or breakfast or whatever it was and talk around the table. But it always turned into this thing where we were all talking about stuff. And it was really, really great because it was like this sort of weird, it was a different type of bridge to, New York or Europe or or the outside world. It was just fantastic. And I think, we owe her a debt, and I definitely owe her a debt.
So she died last summer,
Sorry to
dementia.
hear that.
And a couple months before she died, I brought up the stick figures with her, and that we had sort of started being in touch with each other. And I showed her the single that she had, and she didn't have very many words left at that time, but she pulled this entire sentence out of wherever it came from, and she said, "Those were good times." So she had a lot of fond memories.
That's special. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. My condolences to you, Moretti, and thank you for sharing that. And it's always something I'm curious about. Is just what do the families think? The parents. What's going on and all that. So you mentioned Andy Warhol, and I have to kind of touch on this because one of the genres that the stick figures kind of get lumped into is that art punk kind of sound. So talk a little about your interest in art. Did you have interest at that time in different artists? Were you following the scene of that going on too? Because it kind of had a connection with the music in many ways. So what was that like for you, and who were some of your favorite artists?
Well, we saw a lot of art. Like when we went to Baltimore, when we were in New York, we were constantly going to shows, and I saw some really amazing, like I guess Adolf Wolfley and some sort of outsider artists that always interested me a whole lot. So I think we definitely were aware of what was happening and interested in everything that was happening. I think we all took art classes, at least introductory art classes at USF. So we had some sort of working vocabulary and knowledge of modern art. So.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, my parents are not art people, but they always thought that, you should show your kids culture. So when we, I actually spent the first 7 years of my life in Chicago. So, when we would travel, they'd take us. So you would go to the Met in New York, and it would be like that scene in The Band of Outsiders by Godard, where they're all running through the Louvre because they want to do the whole of the Louvre in under an hour or whatever it is. It would be like that. It's like, we have to see every single picture in the Met, and they had no idea what it was about. It was like, okay, we saw that one. Now we need to see all the rest of them. And that was kind of my first exposure to what art was like. But, it's just, I always was aware of it. And also reading about reading about the Beatles and John Lennon and that stuff, you would then go on to reading about Yoko Ono, her involvement with Fluxus. So what is Fluxus? You'd go to find these things out. I mean, that was the great thing, is for me, the sort of like rock icons of my day were all people who came, they weren't necessarily wealthy people or anything, but they all had an interest. And part of that was just the fact that in England, where a lot of these people were, with the education system, if you were at school and at 16 you were leaving school, you would either go on to university or be like, well, you can go to work. But if you didn't want to go to work, you'd go to art school, which was like when you were 16 to 18. That's why they'd all go to art school, because otherwise they'd have to go to work, So that's why so many people who were into music would go to art school, because it meant you could stay in school, not have to get a job in a factory, and give you a couple more years before you had to go to work. But it also meant that they had that connection. And there was such a background of a lot of those 60s musicians with art from their studies at art school, which basically was a way of not going out and working in a factory, but it meant that they had that. And that was also intertwined in the 60s, and growing up in the 60s, that was all there. Those images were there all the time. It was, it was in the news. And by the time I moved to New York, one of the jobs I was doing there was I used to drive a truck delivering art between galleries and museums in New York, and then taking them down to Florida and to Texas. This was later on. But you're actually there, like going to Warhol's later day factory, picking up print editions and throwing them on a truck and driving them across the country. So there was always this sort of, interwoven thing of the kind of music we did and art, and we all were aware of it. Most of us, I did an art minor. I think both of you ended up doing an art major, didn't you? And then MFAs or whatever.
I did an English degree undergraduate, actually,
okay.
and then master's in fine arts.
Right, because I did an English degree with a minor in art, so we were all very much a part of that. And we also had USF is a funny place because it was just it's your basic Florida. It's a state university, not very well known. It's not like Gainesville. When we were there, it didn't have sports teams. Now it's got sports teams, but it didn't then. So they put their money into other things. So when we were at USF, John Cage would come, and we'd see him perform. When John Waters did Pink Flamingos, they did the southeastern U.S. premiere there, so we got to go see him talk about that. Angela Davis did a lecture. Buckminster Fuller did a lecture there, and the art department, the guy who ran the print lab, which Rob knew him a lot better than I did, Theo Wojcik, he actually used to do a load of printing in there, I guess, for Rauschenberg and other really well-known artists. So we were kind of in the middle of this thing where we always had our one foot in the, in the art department. And as Moretti and I were both doing English degrees, there was also, we would sit and talk about what books we were reading. And I remember there was a guy, Craig Schneider, who was a photographer, in terms of he would go to Ms. Lucky's club and take pictures of all the bands. But he talks about to this day how he thought it was so funny that we would all get together and talk about what books we're reading, not just what records we were listening to, but I was reading this or you were reading that, and he always thought that was the oddest thing. It was a few years younger than us. Books were something that your mom made you do for school. So we had a lot of those different influences, cultural influences coming together. At the college, we also had a really good film series, which a guy who he hit drums for us for a while. He wasn't really a drummer, but he sat in when we didn't have one. Rick Sugden, he used to run a lot of the film series that they would show on campus, and he would bring amazing stuff in, probably because he wanted to see it. So he'd bring in all this stuff. So you would get all these different types of movies coming in there. And we did a gig one time in a science lab. Rob, I'm not sure if this was with you in the band or before your time, where we're in the big science, auditorium with the tiered seats and the table in the middle with the sink in it. And we set up all around it and we played our set, and then they showed Eraserhead. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we were doing back in, like 1979. So all of that stuff came together, and it all influenced what we were doing musically. And we were all doing other stuff as well. We were all taking art classes, and, we were engaged in all that stuff as well. So it was, there was a lot of different activity around the core. Plus, David and Sid were also doing their composition degrees. So they were writing, serious music pieces and having those shown. And finally, another component was that USF had a really great electronic music studio. So a bunch of old, patchcord style synthesizers, Moog Model 1s and things like that.
Yeah.
And most of us went through and learned how to use that. So we were bringing in all these, different things into our music that weren't necessarily just normal elements of like a punk band. And I think that all of that taken together kind of explains more what we were about than any just what records were we listening to.
Right. That's why I was interested in that side. Yep. Go ahead, Rob.
And I went to USF specifically for the art school. I was really, really interested in, I think at the time I was obsessed with printmaking. And I think at the time Theo Wojcik and Don Saff and Michael Felice and Mike Cantwell were all teaching there, and that's their forte. So I was like, okay, I can I think I got in trouble with the art school because I took too many studio classes and not enough, theory and art history, just because it was all this stuff available to me. And I mean, you mentioned Warhol, I guess because I mentioned Warhol. I mean, and there's an odd seminal moment in Andy Warhol and my family, in that my parents were subscribers to like Time magazine and Newsweek, like Bill was talking about, sort of this idea of exposing the kids to the culture. And so they always would point out articles, to us when we were really little. Oh, you might be interested in this. And I remember, because I drew all the time, and we had a chalkboard in our kitchen that I was constantly ruining my parents' messages with drawings of trains and things like that. They said, oh, you like to draw? You might want to check this guy out. And it was one of these Time magazine, Man of the Year or something, with Andy Warhol on the cover. And around the same time, they were starting to buy us 7 inches of like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Dave Clark 5. And at some point, when LPs became more of a thing, we got our first Beatle records and our first Stones records. Suddenly this white record appeared in our house with a banana on the front of it. And they know, they think, oh, it's just another one of these kooky bands that makes hits. And so these little kids suddenly had the Velvet Underground's first record in the house. So that immediately struck me as like, wait a minute, this is that guy in the magazine. So my little brain started going, okay, I need to find out more about this guy, because this is really interesting. So I ended up doing my bachelor's at US. Well, we didn't finish at USF. Up in New York, I finished it at Rutgers. But I did my undergraduate degrees in art and my MFAs in art out here. And then I taught for 473 years. But that was the sort of seed, really. So, Dad.
So the stick figures after the 7-inch, we never had a full-length release. What happened at that point? Did just lives kind of get busy, or what do you think was the reason why the stick figures didn't put out any other records after that one?
I think it was just because when we went to start recording it, and we had there was a little label in England called Glass Records, that led by a guy called Dave Barker, and they had heard the single and said, hey, I'd be interested in putting out an album, but there wasn't like a budget. We would have to record it and then give it to them. So we started doing that, but it was just the fact that moving to New York when Robert and I are the oldest. Everybody else was, a year or two younger than us, and the other thing was that obviously I was the only one who I actually finished my degree, which made getting, a job and things a lot easier in New York than if you didn't finish your degree and you're trying to find a college to finish up there and things. So it was a bit easier for me than everyone else. I think it was just, it's tough to move to New York. We were kind of the last generation where you could do it on a shoestring without a lot of financial support from somewhere. You could still in those days move into an apartment with no furniture for not too much money, and literally where I first ended up. And you were in the same apartment, right, Moretti? And we moved in with my sister and her boyfriend, and it was in New Jersey across the river, and we didn't have any furniture or beds or heating in November. So we would all put our coats on and literally lie down on the floor next to each other to stay. It was, people don't do that now, but that it literally was like that when we moved there, and then gradually some of us had more luck than others in finding jobs, apartments and things like that. But, it was a tough place to just go to without any sort of parental support or a proper job. So I was able to stick it out because I had a job there. Actually, Moretti and I both worked in the same company, which was an educational film company in Manhattan. So that was like a proper job. Didn't pay tons, but it was a proper job. But I think that Sid was working in, what was he working in, like an electronics store or record store or something?
No, he was at Barnes and Noble Classical in the Trade Center.
Oh, okay. But I'm not sure everybody would struggle because you're having to do these commutes in and out of the city, and everything was very expensive compared to Florida, and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
just a hard place for a bunch of 20 teens or 20 somethings to move to with no financial support from anywhere else. So
Yeah, I found being in New York pretty difficult. And I was having some mental health struggles. And really, that's what sort of ejected me from the city and back to Tampa. I was pretty young. And I don't know, I just reached a point where I couldn't kind of try to swim up there anymore. So I just went home.
And I think when you're young, you don't realize how difficult and what a toll that commute mentality takes on your body. Like, I really got sick of it out here, and I was just driving 25 minutes to Cal Arts. In New York, it's like, you get on a bus to go to the PATH train, and the PATH train goes into Manhattan, and then you get on a subway, and you do that every day. When you're 22 or 21, you don't really think about what that does to you, but it really, and it does wear you out. And if you're a little bit naive, you're not aware of your physical health. You're not aware of your mental health. You just know that it's like, good God, I'm tired all the time, and I don't have any money.
Yeah.
Like, I was lucky in that I found like an incredibly cheap place in Brooklyn, and then the Lower East Side, and then eventually New Jersey. Sid found an incredibly cheap place in New Jersey, but we were still doing that weird, all day kind of commute thing.
And then trying to do overnight sessions to do music, which means when you get together, you're asleep or cranky or, kind of at your wit's end. So
all of the above.
Yeah. And plus, I think by this point I went back to school. So I was trying to juggle 2 jobs, going to school, and then, riding on buses and trains all the time. Of course, when I got older, it didn't seem so hard, but when you're a newbie, it's a little bit hard. But it was also exciting, so you sort of ignore it. But when you ignore it, that's when you really get worn down by it, I think.
Yeah. Did you realize after all these years with the Archaeology record that came out from Floating Mill, did you realize after all these years there was still interest in the band's music?
Oh, yeah.
I would occasionally see something on Discogs or something, and you would say somebody bought, a copy of our single for $45, things like that. And
that's pretty cheap, actually.
Really?
Yeah, not anymore, Bill. It's like $75.
Yeah, it's gone up.
Dust off my spare copies.
My students were buying the 7-inch. Like, I couldn't believe. Like, I have one of my students is a kind of a famous post-punk musician, and we would talk about music, and she found out somehow that I was in the Stick Figures, and from her, another kid knew about it who was in a band on campus, and it turned into this thing. And suddenly all these little kids at Cal Arts, I'm sorry, not little kids, college students, were buying our 7-inch that was 38 years old. So I mean, I don't think it's the attraction, like this old guy was in a band once. I think it's like they liked the music. So that was
I sort of put this whole era of my life behind me and went on to do visual art, and wasn't in touch with these guys for decades. And so when Colin asked us if we would be interested, I mean, Bill talked to me about it and said, well, what do you think? And I was like, what in the world? That is so amazing. It's so crazy. And I was telling some people at work about it, and they were like, you were what? You were a singer in a rock band? That's not plausible. I'm sorry, So, but it's been so awesome. I've been able to connect with Bill and Robert again, and actually just started talking to my brother for the first time in a couple decades. And I just think it's been an amazing experience, and I'm delighted that people are enjoying it. Really, it seems awesome.
It's a really timeless I mean, this music, it at least for me, when I listen to it, it's hard to, it was so different You know, like I said, it was just such a meld of different sounds and influences and what have you that it really sounds timeless in many ways. So, how much influence did you have on this record? And just because there's some songs on here that were not on the EP, some live stuff as well. So, how much influence did you have on putting this out, and what were your overall thoughts now that it's available for people to purchase?
Well, Cullen reached out to me because I was the one with the Discogs, an identifiable Discogs account with the stick figures on it. And I had just recently acquired a studio quality cassette player. It was the first time I'd had a proper cassette machine in a couple of decades. And I was kind of going through my old cassettes, and putting together for my own amusement a sort of legacy thing. And I just started that when Cullen reached out and expressed an interest in putting out, a version of the EP. And I said, well, would you be interested in doing a bit more? Because I've got all these other songs. And, they were I had to do a lot of work, digitizing them and going through a lot of stuff to get, EQing and compression and all that to get them to actually sound so that you can listen to them without having to kind of like, so I was actually quite happy with the way that it came out because I spent, literally hundreds of hours doing this. He was a great partner. He was really, really helpful and incredibly enthusiastic. And they do a lot of work on it still. And just the fact that they've reached out to people and gotten everything done, he's been great to work with. So for me, it was a kind of something that I was doing this huge thing, and then I was bouncing it to everybody else, to get their feedback on things. And then Robert and Moretti were both very helpful in getting the artwork together, some of the additional stuff. The front cover was actually, we each did a cover. There were 5 different covers to the original EP. And so that front cover of the album actually comes from Sid's version of the EP cover. And then I just added on the the name and did a couple of other little changes, reformatted it to fit the size, but that was essentially his cover. The other covers are all included within the other artwork, but it was just great to be able to collaborate with everybody again because we hadn't done anything together in a very long time. So
40 years.
And it
40 years.
When I was 11.
And it does say on there, this is our second record. So is this technically the LP that we've been waiting for, or is that still coming out in the works?
I'm actually working with Colin on another LP of stuff, none of which was ever released before, including 4 tracks where we actually had some sort of a master to work from. So there's another whole album like that I've essentially got the music ready to go. We're looking at putting that together sometime this year. And I'm also working on stuff like the 2 live tracks on here. I've got loads of songs that were never recorded in the studio. So I'm going to try and put together, I've got at least another album's worth of stuff of live tracks. Won't be able to achieve quite the same quality sound probably as the 2 albums, but it'd be nice to make them available to people who'd like to hear them. So
Bill and I were actually talking, my sister's favorite song was this song called Alpha Centauri. And I asked Bill about it because that was a song that didn't show up on these lists. And he was like, well, we never recorded a usable copy of it. So then we were like, should we re-record it?
I was gonna be one of my follow-up questions was has there been any, I know everyone's older and has moved away, but with technology you can come together. So has there been any talk of recording some, whether it's re-recording old songs or new music or anything like that?
Well, I've continued recording and I work, I sit in my studio all the time. I'm sitting in it now. And Robert's been working on other types of music, but he's got a studio. Moretti has just invested in some equipment so she can investigate now that she's retired, sound recording in her own right. David does that sort of thing. I'm not so sure. Last time I talked to Sid, he didn't really seem that interested, but things can change. So, it might be fun to do that. I mean, I've also recently retired. In fact, all three of us have. And I'm kind of looking forward to spending my dotage doing recordings with all the various people I've worked with over the years. So, Robert and I are talking about doing another little side project that's kind of like more like the Ellis Otivator Dove 2021 that we did together. A kind of like mix of what I do and what he does, and put through a sort of filter of the two of us. So, I would really like to collaborate with people. And also Moretti and I were in another band, King of Culture, later in New York, and there's a bunch of tracks from that band that Colin may be releasing. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to do stuff. It would be nice to do. I mean, David's he's got quite a full life in New York, and he's got his own band, Nothing But Happiness, where he's, I think, working on his third album with them. He's a bit of a perfectionist, so it takes him a while, but
sure.
I know he's working on that. He actually ended up recording his last album for Glass Records, the record that label that was originally going to put us out back in 1981. So,
with it being 40 years later, what do you think a new Stick Figures album would even sound like?
Really good.
Eclectic. I think it would be super interesting to experiment with it, actually. I do. Who knows what would happen?
Well, based on my experience with Bill with the dub, which was really intensive and really fun, and I think I said this in another interview, it kind of ended up like I mean, Bill and I've talked about this a lot. From day one, dub was this weird outside influence in my interest, and I've always used it as an operating model, technically and just aesthetically. But it stopped being this sort of dub of a dub at some point and became this. Our dynamic became like 1980 dynamic, where we talked about almost telepathically, not to be a cornball and use a cliche, but it really felt like this amazing kind of collaborative sense that felt very much like what the Stick Figures were, because it was this 5-way collaboration, and it was this crazy amount of communication at a level that I haven't known since. So it was just, to me, it really, by the time we were finished, I was like, my God, this is like more like a Stick Figures track than it is a dub. I don't know, Bill, is that
yeah, and I think what it comes down to is the way that we work together. And none of my later bands actually worked like this. They were much more like somebody wrote a song and then we all played them. We worked together like we each had like, an input coming in, and then all 5 of them would collide and everything would kind of like fragment and then come back together in some other unexpected way. And that's kind of what happened when we did this dub thing together. I come from much more of a kind of guitar playing songwriting background, whereas Robert's, working in kind of like soundscapes and rhythms, and I think that because of the way that we did that, I think that's part of the reason we sounded how we did, was that we didn't really expect things to fragment and come back together the way they did. And we'd often, like when we were like arranging a song, we'd all be standing there laughing because we'd go to do something and there'd be some like accident or mishap, and then we'd all laugh and then we'd keep that in. So a lot of things were just kind of like serendipity that would happen within the songs, because we were always just like, a bunch of things colliding and exploding and then gradually forming back into something. And I think that would probably continue to happen, knowing the way that we all are, which is kind of like, no, wait, no, this, what about this? And then something else comes in from over here. It was never like, here's a narrative, now we'll strum that. It was much more like stuff happened. And I don't have necessarily that same way of working with other people I've worked with. It's much more, and the music outcome is different, and that's fine. But I think it would be really interesting to work in that kind of deep collaboration where it's almost like everything happens, in a kind of accidental way, but a lot of those accidents are what make you laugh, and then you keep those in. So I
Yeah,
think it would be very interesting to do. It's always hard because we're all going on all these different trajectories in our lives, but it would certainly be interesting.
Yeah, I think it would be like 5 people in the kitchen making paella and all cooking. On the same.
One's a vegetarian, one doesn't eat seafood, one can't stand rice.
Nice. Besides, more on the more well-known side, I know obviously John Peel was aware of your music. Anyone else that you're aware of who was a little more, someone that was pretty well-known, musician or someone that you caught wind that was into your music as a Stick Figures or was a fan?
Pylon. They came to see us in Atlanta. Remember that, guys?
Yeah.
Vanessa and Michael, and I don't know if Randy and Curtis came. That's so long ago, I can't remember, but I very clearly remember talking at length to Vanessa and Michael, who I still talk to this day. They really like our music.
Yeah, and we used to when we were in King of Culture, Moretti and I used to support when they would come to Maxwell's. They would give us the support slots, so we played with them there a couple of times as well.
Matt Pinfield.
What?
I think Matt Pinfield also, who is like at MTV or VH1, one of the TVs. He was at Rutgers Radio when we moved to New York, and he played us a lot on WRSU, New Brunswick. He was kind of a fan. I mean, these are things I'm just pulling out of the top of my head from 1981.
There was also a guy that I knew because he was in a band in Gainesville. The band then was called the Vulgar Boatmen, which continues to this day in a very changed format. Walter Salas-Sumara, who later had a band called the Silos. Don't know if you've heard of them.
I have.
Well, he actually did on one of his solo albums, his first solo album, he did a cover of September. So
really?
A lot of people
Didn't know that.
Through that. But, I also, when he formed the Silos, he was up in New York and I knew him. He was a painter and somebody that I knew. So when he was auditioning people to join the solos, I would go along and play bass for the auditions. So, he was somebody that I knew musically and did things with, but, he was also, a fan of the Stick Figures. So.
And Bill, don't you have I thought I read somewhere that some connection with Kevin Shields of My Bloody Valentine. It was a guitar of some sort. Am I right on that? Is there a story behind that?
So in 1986, the band I was in, Crash, went over to England to do a 6-week tour. And the second show we did there was in Manchester, where we supported My Bloody Valentine. So this would be November of 86. And we just got on really well with them and we hung out with them. This was before Belinda was in the band. It was when Dave was still the singer. And we all lived in London, so we would all meet up because there was a scene around the Camden Falcon at the time, and Alan McGee would hang out there, and Jesus and Mary Chain, the bass player, Douglas actually ran the club, and Jeff Barrett, who later had Heavenly Records, helped run, he ran the sort of bar end of it. So that whole scene had all these bands like My Bloody Valentine were there, Primal Scream were there, Loop were there, members of the Jesus and Mary Chain, so we would all hang out together. So Kevin was recording all these songs and he was going to do his next single, and he had just switched from being on his old record label, I can't remember the name of it at the moment, to Creation. And they hadn't really become popular. Belinda had now joined the band. And we would get together and talk about sound and stuff and, equipment and music and other things. And so I said to him, you should borrow some of my gear, because he had like a sort of crappy old transistor amp and a not very good guitar. So I loaned him my Jazzmaster, my Jaguar, and my Fender tube amp that I had at the time. And he used those, and the output was the You Made Me Realize EP. So, and then he went on to record most of Isn't Anything and most of Loveless using my guitar, over time acquiring his own guitars that were similar. And so when he went on the road in 92 for Loveless, I went along as the guitar tech, which was, kind of just a jolly. I mean, it was sort of grueling because it was a bus tour of clubs, but, we crisscrossed America and England, Australia, Japan, and I went with them to France, and then I had enough and went back to my life. But
And I got to hang out with Bill in LA. Remember that?
right at the whiskey, yes. So yes, I've known him for years, and that it's the same guitar used on much of the stick figure stuff that I bought in a trailer
Wow.
park for $125.
Oh,
So
That's a great story. As we start to kind of round things out, I like to kind of let my guests kind of close out the interview with obviously there's a lot of people who really still care about the stick figures and are interested in hearing what else is coming out, some of the unreleased music and perhaps what might be coming. Who knows what the future may hold. So I'd like to kind of hear from each of you just to kind of close out the interview. Anything you'd like to share to fans, whomever has been an important part of your musical journey. Who would like to kind of start with the wrap up?
go ahead, Robert.
me.
You.
Why me? Gosh, I don't know how to wrap it up. Other than this next record and what Bill and I are maybe going to work on, and my stuff. One of the things that might seem a little sentimental right now is I kind of would like to say stuff about some of the scene in Tampa, and say hi and thanks to Lester and Alan. And Darren and Brent, who lived in LA for a really long time. So I see them. And Walter, who also, although Gainesville, much like John Eder, I'd like to shout out to them. Mike Knapp and Jim Brown. I mean, people that I see on Facebook, but it's like they live all over the place now. But it's been really fun, but it's also been really exciting to sort of, I think I did a little quote in another interview that Bill took these tapes that were either fragments of multi-tracks that had been baked or runoffs, and over the progress of time sort of made them feel like I was in the stick figures with headphones on in a studio or at a gig. And that's a wild jump. And it's a really admirable thing, to have done. A lot of credit needs to land in his lap, I think, because it really turned out to be a dynamic thing. And I think it was his work that really made it successful, but also personally for me, it's kind of like being in the middle of it again, just listening to it. It's really been fun. And it's just been wonderful to collaborate, and even better to talk to the other four people in the band. So it's been really wonderful on a lot of different levels.
I guess I would say that time in my life was such a special time. I've never felt as intensely, I've never been involved with such amazingly creative people again. I've done some collaboration with visual artists, but it's nothing really compared to that experience. So I would just like to thank them for being a part of my life at such a pivotal moment, and all the people out there that supported us, that were just so wonderful to see and hang out with. So I guess that's mine. Wrap up.
Well, I just like to, again, thank Colin and his mates at FMR for really making this possible. And everybody, I mean, it's really exciting that people are listening to it and enjoying it and finding something in it that's more than just nostalgia, which is kind of the feedback I'm getting, is that people are actually enjoying it for what it is. It's not just some sort of a, something we've dug up from under the earth. So that's really exciting for me. And I'm really hoping that we can carry on, with the other music that the stick figures have in our archives, and it would be great to do any kind of collaboration going forward in whatever format with all these guys, because it was a very exciting time for me musically, even though I've done a lot of things since. They've always been in a kind of a very different vein than what that was. So I learned an awful lot from everybody in the band at the time, which I think we all sort of learned things from each other. We were all really young, but it was it changed my life meeting all these people when I went, from Naples, where I was living, to Tampa, and it just basically opened me up to all the other things that later were important to me in my life. So it was an incredible time, and I'm just glad that other people are able to hear it all.
Thank you to all three of you. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to Steve Rollman from Pure Honey. I don't know if you had a chance to maybe chat with him at all. Robert, you may have, but I didn't realize at the time that there was a 12-inch record coming out. I just hadn't caught any buzz about it. I'm pretty connected to Florida music, and when I heard, I was aware of, I knew of the 7-inch. When Steve said, "Hey, he sent me the link to the Bandcamp," and I was like, "No way!" Wow, wow! Like, because it's so wonderful. I mean, obviously music in general, but when someone is putting out something from the Florida archives, stuff that should see the light of day, but sometimes it never gets a chance to for whatever reason. It was so wonderful to just listen to those songs and listen to the stuff that hasn't been released, some of the live stuff. So I got to give a shout out to Steve from Pure Honey, because he tipped me off to it, got me in touch with Cullen, and got me in touch with you three. So it's wonderful to be able to have you on the podcast and talking about going, taking a trip down memory lane as 40 years, but there's still interest in your music, and it's so nice to be able to have something physical that we can listen to, and the art that's in it, and the liner notes and all of that is so special. So it was been wonderful. Thank you all for being such fabulous guests today, and I appreciate having you on the podcast.
Thanks for
Gosh,
having
thank
us.
you.
So much.
Have a great rest of your day, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with everyone, and the stick figures live on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.